Hey everyone, another week, another edition of DF Direct Weekly, and this one, looking at my notes, 176th edition. A ton of news stories to plough through this week, so let's get straight onto the panel. And John Linneman, hi.
Hey Rich, yes, good to be here this week. It's been a little bit, been very, very, very busy, still busy, but it's been good.
Yep, obviously we've got a lot of cramming to do before we head off to Gamescom next week.
Oh yeah.
And actually I'm going to take a supporter question before we move on. Will, where you been? What's been happening in your life? From Joe Tango. Will Judd is back. Hello.
Hello. Who are you guys again? I think I recognize you. It's Jam and Ronald or something, right? That's you guys. Yeah. I haven't seen you guys for a while, but it's good to be back. Thank you.
Indeed.
So, Will, at this point, I usually do a quote-unquote shout-out for the Digital Foundry store, but as you are sort of our primary guy on the Digital Foundry store, would you like to do a shout-out for the Digital Foundry store?
I would love to do a shout-out for the Digital Foundry store on store.digitalfoundry.net, probably. It's so good. We have so many nice things. Have you guys seen our mouse pad? It's the size of an entire desk if your desk is, about kind of this kind of size.
Yeah.
And it's gorgeous. I really love the artwork. It's got the DF Fighters kind of community artwork, which is just absolutely fantastic. I've not seen it in the flesh, but every photo I've seen has just been outstanding. And the samples I got beforehand of the actual material are really, really good. So yeah, please do check it out and all of our lovely, lovely wares.
Absolutely. Good job there.
Wow.
Lots to go through. Let's crack on with the first news topic. Okay, so first news topic of the week. Last week, Game Science, the developers of Black Myth Wukong, released a benchmarking tool for PC that enabled PC users to get to grips with the rendering load of the game, to give some expectation level of what they can expect the game to run at on their hardware. Now, this is Future Rich talking here because in this segment, I actually used our Frankenstein's PC to try to emulate the kind of performance we could expect to see on PlayStation 5, because thus far, we haven't actually seen anything on PlayStation 5, which is a bit of a way. We'll talk about that in the segment. However, 24 hours after we recorded this direct, IGN China actually put out about a minute worth of gameplay, boss gameplay from the PlayStation 5 version of the game. And here it is. And it raises a lot of more questions than I was expecting, because the capture quality here isn't great at all. We can give you no idea of the kind of image quality you can expect to see from the PlayStation 5 version of the game, because the quality of this footage is exceptionally poor, I would say, even though it's actually a 4K asset, seemingly. And yeah, performance-wise, it does seem to be targeting 60 frames per second. We'll talk about that with my Frankenstein's PC tests in the actual recording segment. But there do appear to be some performance drops on heavy alpha effects as part of the course, really. But I guess at least Game Science is targeting 60 FPS. There does seem to be a 60 F performance mode, but we don't know anything beyond that. I'm going to raise a couple of concerns that I have with the footage based on the IGN China captures here. Image quality is poor. Is this because of the poor quality of the capture? Is it because of YouTube compression? We just don't know, right? I mean, what I can say is there's a lot of compression in there. It doesn't look great. However, there's some oddities in this footage. And I do think that there is a case that AMD FSR3 frame generation may be in use in this particular clip, whether it's an option in the game or not in PlayStation 5. I just don't know at this point. We've literally just been given a minute of footage with no context, but you can see if you kind of go slow-mo on the footage here, that there's a kind of strobing effect. Typically, you do see that with frame generation. There are other artifacts as well to bear in mind. When you have a particularly fast pan, you can see on the edges of the screen that there's like a border of, well, it's difficult to describe really, but it just doesn't really look right. It would present similarly as another kind of strobing effect. I think the one thing that does make me think that it isn't about the quality of the capture, but could be FSR3 frame generation, is that when you look at particles, frame by frame, you can see that you have a fully formed particle and then 2 ghosting particles, fully formed particles, ghosting particles in a strobe again. And this is classic frame generation behavior. So, we're going to go into the segment now, but you can see that, yes, there is a performance mode. We've got some metrics for you here based on the footage. Now, you might say the footage is poor quality, so how can we analyze it? The answer is by eye. I literally went through 4,500 frames, manually tagging the ones that were duplicate frames to give you this analysis. So based on the quality of the footage, even with the poor quality, I'm reasonably sure that this footage is accurate based on the clip that was presented anyway. And yeah, the image quality concerns, I think we're just going to have to wait and see and look at the final game, which, is a couple of days away as I record this. But it doesn't really tie in with the quality of the results I was able to get from the Frankenstein's PCs. So very, very interesting. But anyway, on with the original segment. Okay, so next week, I think it's August the 20th, we'll see the release of the eagerly awaited Black Myth Wukong, and seemingly out of nowhere, a benchmark tool dropped on Steam, which enables you to basically access one single scene from the game, basically a scripted flyby over a stream through a sort of forest environment, and it essentially tells you what kind of performance you should be expecting to see from the game. And yeah, it's basically quite enigmatic, I'd say. I'm not even sure it's actually a stress test as such. I mean, it seems like a fairly leisurely sort of wind down a forest stream. That's it. But you do get to see stuff like the full ray tracing. I'm going to take point on this one because there's something else that's emerged, which is that it doesn't look as though we're going to be seeing the game on PlayStation 5 until launch. And yeah, I mean, that's slightly problematic because, well, it could well just be the case that it needs final polish and that'll arrive in the day one patch and they don't want reviewers to see it before then. But equally, whenever this happens, there's always question marks raised over game performance, which isn't particularly great, right? Okay, so what we're doing here is essentially very similar to what I did for Oliver's work on the Space Marine preview, which was basically to take our Frankenstein's PC, as Alex likes to pronounce it, which is essentially the Xbox Series X CPU running Windows, paired with AMD's RX 6700, which is the closest GPU counterpart in the PC space to the PlayStation 5's GPU. And yeah, interesting stuff here, because obviously we've not seen anything yet from Black Myth Wukong on PlayStation 5, as far as I know. And, well, let's take a look. First of all, because my computer was set to 4K resolution, it's defaulted to 4K within Black Myth Wukong's benchmark. And I pressed the recommend settings button, which just seemed to be high across the board. With FSR upscaling set to 50%, so 1080p going to 4K. But I actually decided to move to TSR because I believe that TSR quality overall is better than FSR. Actually, I'm going to segue a bit here to 4K 30 comparison with both on balanced mode, FSR and TSR. I do think that the FSR version is not quite as good as TSR, particularly in terms of particles. There's a lot of ghosting going on there. Vegetation, kind of strange. It's typically a nightmare scenario for FSR2 there. It's not great, but then again, it's not particularly fast movement, not a lot of disocclusion going on. So arguably, it's giving FSR a more than fair shake, if you like. Anyway, let's look at the performance numbers. 41.35 FPS with performance mode, that's 1080p, versus balanced mode, which is about 60% of 4K, 34.07 FPS. So basically, we've got a good margin for overhead if we keep on performance mode. that overhead drastically reduces if we increase the resolution, the internal resolution that is, to balance mode. Essentially, you gain 21.3% of performance by using performance instead of balance. But of course, if there is a 30 FPS lock on a console game, nothing stopping the developer using dynamic resolution scaling. And I think it looks pretty good, I have to say. I think it looks absolutely fine.
My big concern there, Rich, is like you mentioned FSR2, is like we don't know what they're going to do on console. If they use TSR on PS5, it could have pretty decent image quality, but...
Yes, and actually that was a good point raised by Oliver when I shared the initial findings. And, he said, does the game have TSR? And lo and behold, it does. But weirdly, the recommendation button doesn't recommend TSR. But certainly based on a sort of, possibly, but based on a sort of run-to-run comparison, it doesn't seem to be that much heavier, and I do think the quality is better.
Oh, gosh, I hope they don't use if they use FSR2 on PS5, it's going to be it's going to suffer.
It's not going to be great, but yeah, because this is precisely the type of content where FSR2 does tend to struggle, and you do want to have better results than that, I think. Next up, I tried to aim for what you might call a performance mode, 60 frames per second. I dropped the output resolution down to 1440p. So essentially we're trading pixels for frames, if you like. I decided to try a couple of things here with TSR. And yeah, here's some of the graphing. Essentially, we're doing pretty well at TSR performance, 1440p, but let's bear in mind that that's a 720p internal resolution. 58.75 FPS. Now that average is actually being lowered because we've capped at 60, but you can see that we're not locked to 60. So it all really depends as to whether this is representative content of the final game, really. On the right there, you'll see the balanced mode, where we're kind of up to like 60% resolution versus 50%. Anyway, 53.98, 54 FPS essentially. So in the same ballpark, but we're losing more of that lock on 60 frames per second. And yeah, I thought at this point, well, I was actually thinking back to an interview we did with the developers of Immortals of Avium. We were asking them why they went for FSR versus TSR. We think TSR would have given better results. And they came back and said that the answer is performance. The impression they gave us essentially was that FSR2 is more performant than Epic's TSR. However, you can see here that I've actually rerun the benchmark, same settings, TSR versus FSR 1440p. And again, the 60 FPS cap is actually limiting the advantage of TSR, but it does have an advantage over FSR. You can see, across the bench there that generally it's dropping fewer frames. I mean, with that 60 FPS cap, it's only 0.6% faster across the entirety of that sequence. But regardless, TSR is faster and does seem to have a better quality level than FSR. Each of them, though, TSR, FSR, seem to have their own strengths and weaknesses, though. And I think both of them are kind of blighted to a certain extent by the fact that the base image seems to be over sharpened. It's kind of a weird mixture of blur, artifacts, and over sharpening. So I think there's probably more work that can be done by the developer in the run-up to launch to improving image quality with those upscalers. Anyway, I guess my takeaway from this, I mean, I didn't do any ray tracing testing. Maybe the PlayStation 5 version will have ray tracing. It's all a bit of an unknown at the moment. It's going to be a bit of a surprise, I guess, when it all comes to launch day, when we get to see the PlayStation 5 version for the first time. Even so, my takeaways at the moment, a 4K 30 mode seems to be eminently doable based on what we're seeing here. I actually seem to have some latitude there in terms of the pixel count. It looks as though it's pretty viable there. 4K 30 high settings, I think it looks absolutely fantastic. There are some tweaks I'd like to see. Shadow popping on the benchmark, not particularly great at the moment, but even so, the overall presentation just looks fantastic there. Now, it's the 60 FPS performance mode where I think we're going to have possibly some more tweaking required when it comes to game science and their work on PlayStation 5. I think a game like this, ideally, you should be running it at a target 60 frames per second, right? And, if we're using TSR performance mode and not getting 60 frames per second, I mean, there are other ways forward to clawing back performance. I was using the high setting, for example. May well be the case that there are some quote unquote optimized settings that could be introduced there, lower certain elements of the graphical presentation to increase performance, get you closer to 60, introduce dynamic resolution scaling so the GPU is fully tasked, and increasing resolution when it has the capabilities to do so. I'd say that we're not a million miles away from 60, so maybe there's some work that could be done there for the PlayStation 5 version. Of course, running the PC code on console equivalent hardware, it can only ever be indicative, and certainly we've only got a very limited scene to work with here. We've no idea if this is indeed indicative of the way the game actually plays. But even so, I'd say that there's cause for some optimism here, even if we're not seeing the game before launch.
And given, the console nature of it, it might free a little bit of extra, there might be a little extra overhead as well. So that does make it seem like it's going to be a split between quality and performance mode again, which I hope is the case. And I hope they can get a 60 FPS mode, and that you always worry with these titles that they're going to ship something that's just wildly unstable, right? We have no insight right now, basically.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Will?
I mean, it's obviously not great that we haven't been able to have a look ahead of the launch. That normally suggests that there is, I don't know, maybe they're not 100% confident with it. But, based on the results, I think that it sounds like it's in a decent enough place. And as John says, there's always kind of a little bit extra on PS5. We often see slight settings tweaks compared to the PC version that can eke out more performance as well. So, yeah, it's positive impression for sure, and hopefully they can nail the landing, because I know a lot of people have been really looking forward to this one.
Yeah, absolutely. But it does look as though we're going to get to see the game on launch for PlayStation 5, which isn't particularly ideal. But, based on these results, I'm really hoping that everything is going to be okay, because it certainly looks as though the rendering loads are well within the capabilities of console-style hardware. In terms of the actual experience, well, there's not much you can say about a fixed camera run over a stream. And I've got to say, we're putting huge caveats on this because this is literally the only content that we've got to go with, and this is an action-packed game, and we're not seeing any action here. The only thing which did slightly concern me, and I hope it sort of turns up in their telemetry and they fix it, is the first run through was I actually tested it first of all on my 4080 based desktop system, and I could see two pretty egregious stutters during the run. Which isn't great, because it does have a shader burn right at the beginning. You would expect shader compilation to be a non-issue. Then I moved on to the console-like PC, and the stuttering was actually worse. However, it was only on the first run. The subsequent runs seemed to be pretty much flawless within the confines of the GPU. So I do think that maybe the shader compilation run isn't capturing all of the required shaders, which is something that happens quite a lot on Unreal Engine titles, unfortunately. But not great. But hopefully it will be resolved for the final game. John, what do you think about this concept of basically having a benchmark demo coming out a week before the game? I mean, in theory, it's a good idea, right? But you would expect something possibly a bit more challenging. I mean, to give proper expectations for the actual game.
Sure, but I would still say this is better than not releasing a benchmark. I think this is kind of really important, especially for any new PC game that's coming out that's boasting high-end visuals, pushing the envelope. I think this kind of thing is extremely useful, because obviously you're going to have a lot of people that are like, wow, this looks interesting, but I'm not sure if my PC can run it, right? Yeah. And this, whether or not this tackles the most hardcore scenarios, that's up for debate. We'll find out, obviously, when the game hits, but at least it should give people an idea whether or not their computer can actually run the game okay or not. So, which is, that's the best thing that it serves, the best purpose right there. So, I think it's a great thing, but we don't really see it that often. And I suppose part of the reason is that it's essentially its own little project, right? It's its own little product. It's free, but it takes dev time and work to get this kind of thing ready and prepped for release. So not everybody's going to have the luxury of being able to do that. I think it's pretty cool that they were able to do so. And honestly, in general, this game, I'm kind of happy that people are excited for it, because it is even though it's based on things, it is still a new IP from a company that hasn't really been in the spotlight before, right? So it is a chance to see some new developers tackle something that looks really cool. So
and certainly when you see the content, it does look spectacular.
It does.
So, in terms of putting the best foot forward, so to speak, it does a great job there. It does sort of get you hyped up for the game to come. I also noted that there is an option in there. I mean, I talked about telemetry earlier. There's an option in there not to phone home with data, which suggests that they are phoning home with data. So hopefully, hopefully the benchmark runs that thousands upon thousands of people are doing in the run up to launch could be providing valuable data and potentially some gotchas. I don't know. What do you think about that, Will?
Yeah, I mean, that seems pretty sensible to have the option, but let people opt out of it. Certainly, I think from looking at the trailers for the game, you can tell that they really care a lot about how it looks and how it runs, and they want to do something that's very technically ambitious. So it makes sense to test things out and really spend the extra time and care to make sure things are as good as possible for launch. So I guess it remains to be seen whether if there's any kind of late breaking data that suggests that it wouldn't play well on some systems or something like that, whether they would have time to actually fix it on launch, but at least they get a week's head start essentially.
I wanted to buzz in. I'm wondering if any of you guys tried it on the Steam Deck.
No.
Wow.
I haven't had time. I don't know though. Scale it down. I mean, if it's doing 60 FPS at 1440p on PS5 style hardware,
that's what I'm thinking, right?
Yeah.
Drop the settings, drop the resolution, settle for 30 FPS. Possibly we could give it a go.
Find out.
Okay, so coverage plans. Well, obviously we're going to get Alex onto the game as soon as possible, and we'll be delivering optimized settings, I guess. And hopefully we'll get to see the PlayStation 5 version as well. We'll try and get coverage to you ASAP there. The issue being that, a good contingent of the Digital Foundry team is heading to Gamescom. So, that does introduce some issues. That said, John, Alex and I will be at Gamescom, so if you see us, come and say hello. Let's move on to the next news topic. Okay, so this is the primary reason why I wanted Will to be on the Direct this week, because we talked about Ryzen 9000/Zen 5 last week and the kind of lukewarm reception that the new processors had. And the following week, this week, we actually got to see reviews for the Ryzen 9 products. Now, these are the Halo products, right? The ones that we should be really excited for, the 12-core and the 16-core products. And, well, the docket, the news point here says Zen 5 launch unravels. Things have kind of gone not quite to plan, right, Will? There's a bit of a behind-the-scenes story about this.
Yeah, so basically there's a lot of, I think, confounding factors around this launch. In general, it seems like the performance is not as you would typically expect. Normally, when we get a new generation of products, we would expect to see, a some percent increase across a wide range of games. And typically we would see, the higher end parts in a typical generation outperforming the lower end parts. And we would see the new generations being faster than the old, right? But with Ryzen 9000 and specifically the 9900X and 9950X, it doesn't seem like that's the case a surprising amount of the time. And this isn't just something that's kind of featured in our testing, but this is something that has been seen, basically every review I've read. And I've read a lot of reviews after the embargo date, trying to understand exactly what's really happened with this launch. So it's so weird, because normally when you're testing a CPU, you kind of start to get your results and you think, okay, yeah, that's more or less reasonable, makes sense. But then if you start getting results where the new processor is 15% slower than the previous one, in a game, you start to think, well, hang on, something must be wrong with my setup here. Maybe I don't have the right driver installed. Maybe there's a bug. Maybe the motherboard isn't set up properly. So it induces a kind of fear, and you need to just check everything in your setup to make sure it's right. And that obviously takes away from the testing time that you would normally have. So it was a nervous time for sure. But
I know exactly where you're coming from, because when a product arrives that doesn't conform to expectations, and you're given what you might call spoon-fed benchmarks for reference by the manufacturer, and they're not matching. The question is, what am I doing wrong? That's the first thing. And, I think you did the right thing. You talked to AMD, you shared results and said, this isn't in line with your reference guide. What's going on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so they had a range of suggestions, some of which were fairly basic, like, have you tried turning the system off, turning it back on, leaving it for a bit, which is, generally accepted benchmarking practice, but you might be so eager to get into the benchmarking, you might neglect something like that. And they had various...
It's very IT crowd, though.
Absolutely.
It off and on again.
Yeah.
Word.
I mean, and to be fair, that wasn't the very first thing they suggested. I think that was kind of a Hail Mary.
In?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Can you see anything on the screen at the moment?
Okay, your computer is the box next to that other thing. That's your monitor.
Yeah, exactly. So, we did go through quite a few kind of troubleshooting steps, because it turns out that the Ryzen 9 parts from this generation use the same kind of core parking driver, which was previously only reserved for the 2 CCD X3D parts from last generation. So it'd be the 7950 X3D and the 7900 X3D. They needed extra software to make sure that tasks were being correctly assigned to the CCD that had the extra cache. So this generation, there's no X3D parts yet, but they still need a similar kind of driver to make sure things are seemingly happening on the same cache, because there was some very interesting research that came out afterwards stating that CCD to CCD latencies are super high. So previously on the 7950X, it was something like 76 nanoseconds, according to AnandTech, to go from one cluster of CPUs to CPU cores to the other cluster, right? And that's fairly standard. But this generation, it was 180 nanoseconds in their testing, which is hugely slow.
Double.
And in fact, it's almost double the time it takes to get to DRAM, which is like, in a completely different postcode, basically. So there's something really odd with this architecture in general. And it seems like for all core workloads, it maybe doesn't make much of a difference. But for gaming, it seems like there's a lot of extra special care that has to be, instituted for things to work as they should. And it's just really strange. It's a weird place to be.
I don't really know what to say, because some of these numbers here are just kind of bizarre.
Yeah.
The concept that you've got two chiplets, right? 8 cores on each, or 6 cores on each if you've got the 9900. And basically, to communicate between those two chiplets, the time taken is far, far higher than it was in the last generation. And as you say, higher than just talking directly to DRAM, which is, you said it's in a completely different postcode, but it's, this is completely off chip, There's no fast interconnect to DRAM, and yet it's like half, it's twice as slow on the chip itself. This is kind of baffling. And this idea that you're using software to keep games running on one CCD, that is almost an admission that there's an issue, right? Surely.
Absolutely, yeah. And it seems like, this just obviously introduces a lot of potential errors. And now looking at other results, in fact, I think it was Gamers Nexus that published similar guidance to the one that was provided to us before the launch. And they had an extra step, which we unfortunately weren't provided with, which tests if the core parking has actually been enabled properly. And on both of our test systems, the one that we were using initially and the completely fresh Windows install that we did just to make doubly sure that there wasn't any problem, it was working correctly on both of those all along. So the core parking wasn't the issue, but still performance is very bad, potentially because of this really high latency between the different chiplets. So it's a very, very strange situation. Another thing is that AMD provided some numbers as a quick test of whether things should be working correctly. And I think they quoted something like 200 FPS in Cyberpunk at 1080p high, or 210 FPS on the 9950X. And I got about 170 on that benchmark, which is not even, in the same region. But it looks like, I think this was a Hardware Unboxed discovery, that they were running their numbers on a local admin account, which boosts performance by a significant margin, like plus 10 FPS or something, which is strange, but also it kind of helps to explain why the numbers in our reviews guide were perhaps a little bit higher than we could actually realistically achieve in the field. So it seems to be a confluence of lots of different factors that have kind of made this into a very confusing launch.
Right. Okay. I think some of the issues that we've got is that in some tests, am I right in saying that it's worse than the 12 and 16 core parts are producing marginally worse results than the 6 and the 8 core parts?
Yes, particularly the 9700X seems to be the best performing one in games in general. But it tends to be just a few percentage points that's the case. But there are some titles where it seems significantly worse, and maybe as a result of this chiplet to chiplet thing.
I've just been completely baffled by this. I mean, I said to John last night, Will's coming on to talk about Zen 5, Ryzen 9000. And John, you were completely oblivious to all of this drama.
Yeah.
You were still talking about incorrectly labeled CPUs in the channel.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, classic.
Which seems so long ago now.
Yeah.
I know. It's like, this just kind of snuck up and you're like, dude, read this. Send me the link. And I'm just like, oh, this is not good. What's happening in the world of CPUs lately? It feels like the whole industry's on fire.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this was the biggest open goal imaginable for AMD, right? Because if they come up with another, it's 15% faster, it's more efficient, it runs cooler, and, the prices are slightly lower than they were, especially in the UK because of the pound being stronger now. Previously we were looking at something like a pound was worth 129 in September 2022 when the previous generation launched. So all of the pound prices were like £30 more than the equivalent in dollars. So it was not great if you were in the UK. And now it's actually quite reasonable. It's 459 and 609 for the new parts, which is, obviously more than Ryzen 7000 on the current market, but it's still a step towards making it more affordable. So if the performance had been in line and everything else was okay, then this could have been an amazing generation for AMD. But as it stands, I think we're kind of waiting to see if, this performance can be fixed with like a microcode update or a chipset driver or something like that. Or maybe the X3D chips will just be really good again. But at the moment, it's difficult to recommend.
Yeah, I mean, the 7800 X3D still seems to be the best gaming processor, and I guess we can wait for the X3D parts on Ryzen 9000, but if we're not seeing an uplift from the non-X3D parts, then are we just looking at status quo when the new parts come along with the Vcache? I'm not quite sure. I guess we'll have to wait to find out, but it is all rather bizarre because you would expect a flood of new chips, Ryzen 9000 chips, to be entering the channel, followed by discounting on Ryzen 7000. But if they discount Ryzen 7000, then, basically it's making what looks, for gaming at least, the better chip even cheaper. It's kind of baffling to me. I mean, we've talked about this in the past, but I do think that there is probably different objectives with this product than great all-round performance. I mean, we've talked about data center and laptops where traditionally AMD has lagged behind Intel. and to come up with a great product. I mean, the power efficiency does seem to be a good thing, right? But with that said, isn't it the case that, we were talking rather about the Ryzen 9600X and 9700X last week, and isn't it the case that they're actually going to be increasing the power consumption of those chips with a BIOS update?
Yeah, it does seem like that might be happening. And we did test the 9700X at a higher 105 watt power limit, because AMD did provide those numbers to just slot into the BIOS and test things out. And in content creation, it does make a pretty good difference. You get, I think it was something like 10%, 15%, something like that of extra performance at the cost of hugely increasing power and increasing thermals as well. But in games, it was more or less the same. I think I saw a 2% increase in our Cyberpunk scores. So not really worth the extra, the extra toll on the CPU, essentially, from the heat and the power. So I don't think it'll kind of change the fortunes of the 9700X or 9600X in any significant way for gaming. But for content creation, it's good to have the option, I suppose.
Yeah. The weird thing being, of course, that our 9700X Cyberpunk score was lower than the 6-core 9600X.
Yeah, that is just super weird.
Which is another enigma wrapped in a mystery we couldn't get to the bottom of. It's just a lot going on here. I think it's safe to say that you will see different results from different outlets, because certainly in the realm of CPU testing, to actually find areas in games that are properly CPU limited that can actually give you a decent workout for the various processors, people come up with different scenarios, and we're no different. But the fact that we're not, and the fact that nobody is really seeing much in the way of appreciable gains gen on gen, that's still a bit of an issue, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah. Any final words on this, Will? What do you expect to be happening next? Because AMD have kind of said we're investigating, right?
Yeah, AMD doesn't have any other recommendations at this stage and is investigating the issue further. That was the last I heard from AMD's representative. So I would expect that there must be something odd going on here. I don't think it's... the fact that they don't even... the results don't seem to match AMD's own numbers suggests that there might be something amiss. I would certainly hope that we see some kind of update that fixes things. I very much doubt that it'll suddenly become an amazing gaming part or anything like that. But I think, we should at least expect the new parts to be around the same level as the old ones, if not better.
There is something very, very odd going on here. And there have been sort of suggestions that AMD weren't fully transparent on gaming performance in their supplied benchmarks. I'm kind of actually, I'm thinking that, for the last few years, the kind of vendor-supplied benchmarks have actually been pretty good, fairly representative. But I am thinking now, going back to like Zen 1 Plus, the Ryzen 2000 parts, they were comparing it favorably with Intel's 8th gen core, and, it just wiped the floor with Zen. So that wasn't a particularly great hour from AMD. But the numbers here just don't seem to add up. But it's challenging. I don't really know where we're going to go next with this story. But it certainly leaves Intel with an opportunity here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The 14th gen parts in our testing still performed really well in a lot of games. Obviously, there are significant worries at the moment about degradation. But if new BIOSes are available that in theory should stop that, and the gaming performance isn't harmed too significantly, then they could still be the better choice for gaming. And obviously Ryzen 7000 and the 7800 X3D are still great. So, there are still good options, but the fact that we're seeing discounts on Ryzen 9000 rather than 7000 is obviously quite disappointing.
Yeah, I've just been looking at your timeline for reviews and putting together the coverage, and it was punishing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we came off of a week where we did the 9600 and 9700. And then in that period, because we were also implementing our new benchmarking system, which is automated and generally very lovely, but it is still a work in progress, and actually getting it to work flawlessly every time, and just to set it up in general just takes some time. So we had less time than we would normally have, and then immediately after that review cycle was finished, we're immediately back into the next one. So I spent I've got a little diary here of what I did each day. On Thursday, it basically says recovery from 7 a.m. to 1 a.m. days. Ryzen 9000 arrives. So I got the chips on, I think, midday on Thursday. Friday was testing of the previous gen, because we'd only done the Ryzen 5 and 7 parts. So we did Ryzen 9 previous gen testing. Set up some new games, which we added to the benchmarking suite, kind of as that initial review was going live. And also adding 720p testing. So there's some additional stuff to set up there. And then Monday, we started on the 9900X, and obviously we had all these issues. We had to reinstall Windows. We had to do a lot of retests where normally I would just kind of run through it, say, yeah, that looks more or less fine. Maybe one or two things. Maybe something happened in the background and we need to rerun them. But normally it's pretty straightforward. And then Tuesday, 9950X, a lot more retesting, actually writing up the review. And then Wednesday, I was in London, so I couldn't have any additional benchmarking time. So I had to get up very early, do 14900K, and write up everything. So
yeah, it's crazy.
It was an absolutely packed week for sure. And I don't think it impacted, the quality of our results, but certainly, it takes a lot out of you. And it means that, today and yesterday, I don't have so much of an appetite to immediately dive in and start saying, all right, well, what else is going on? There must be something else we can try. But hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, there is always the obviously it was a pretty tight week for sure. And there's always the sort of fear that you've got something wrong. That something went wrong in the whole procedure, and it's impacting the results. I'm just looking at AMD's instructions that they sent you. Turn it off and on again. I still can't believe that was sorry. Chips, chipset drivers, power profile, process idle tasks. I guess that's just checking that everything is set up as it should be set up. Mm-hmm. Windows should be doing that automatically, right?
Yeah. So this is to do with the core parking essentially. And when you install the chipset drivers, when Windows is idle, it should just kind of set things up in the background. But there's a command you can run to say, do it now, actually. And I did do that command a few times and didn't seem to make any difference to our results, unfortunately. But yeah, it's just a weird situation because I don't feel like the average user is going to make sure that the game bar is updated and, run this weird command. And, they might well install a new CPU, install a game, and then be like, oh, my performance is really bad. That's weird.
Another thing that was suggested was the completely fresh Windows install. There was the suggestion that the different number of CCDs would react differently on an existing install. Mm-hmm. I've never actually seen anything untoward happen with using the same Windows install, particularly on a Windows install that's set for the same platform, AM5 in this case. Did that have any effect at all?
Well, I think, again, that was just to make sure that the provisioning stuff was set up correctly, because I think rightly they wouldn't expect many users to go from a CPU that needed that and one that didn't, or vice versa. But as a reviewer, you may very well do that. So I think that was just an extra step to make sure that that was set up properly. Yeah, super strange. It didn't seem to affect any results, though. So hard to say.
John, you must be sitting back with some degree of bewilderment about all of this.
I'm just taking it all in. It's well, the reason is I haven't used an AMD CPU in my rig since 1998.
Oh my god, we need to get you on board.
It's been that long, but that's the thing is I've been Intel for so long, but after the recent Intel debacle, I was like, well, I mean, I guess for the next rig, I could consider going AMD, and then this stuff starts to happen, and now I'm just gonna sit with my current system for now. Anyway,
well, I suppose John, if you were thinking of upgrading from your 12900K to like a 14900K, by the time you've made the decision, the concept of what's causing the issues with 14th gen should probably be resolved, and you will actually get a pretty appreciable uplift in content creation. And, the chips might be quite cheap at that point, what with Arrow Lake coming soon.
That's true. That's true. We'll have to see then.
Yeah.
But either way, yeah, it's interesting to hear this, and it feels like a gigantic missed opportunity for AMD, given the Intel woes happening right now. This would have been an easy win.
Okay, let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so I'm not sure you can actually announce a delay for a product that doesn't officially
exist.
Actually does officially exist.
Yeah.
They have announced that they are producing a next generation Switch, but there's no release date that's been announced. So it has been kind of leaked that developers are now being told not to expect Switch 2 before April 2025. John, what do you make of this? Because I think the key thing, that the messaging that might be coming across, which is probably unlikely erroneous, is, well, maybe it's coming in April or May 2025. We just don't know at this point, right?
Yeah, I don't think we have any insight into it. Developers don't seem to have much insight into it. We're just waiting to find out more. And Nintendo's going to do it on their own timetable, I suppose. The only things I've gathered information-wise is that perhaps it's just Nintendo themselves needs more time to prepare software for launch. And I think getting that software right is extremely important for the future of the platform. This also kind of moves into... So they announced that Metroid Prime 4 was coming out in 2025 fall, I think, right? Like late in the year.
Really?
Or did 2025? I thought it was for 2025.
I'm sure it's 2025.
Maybe they haven't given a date, but I'm starting to wonder now if that'll be one of the launch titles.
Right.
So
it makes sense, wouldn't it?
But yeah, I mean, it's certainly an interesting situation though, and it kind of the world is so different now, but it gives me shades when the N64 launched. How it just felt like, at the time, it felt like the N64 was coming forever, right? You started hearing about it like 2 or 3 years beforehand. It was, you saw those things in those arcade games like Cruis'n USA, even though it wasn't the same hardware. They were advertising the Ultra 64 there. It's just like, when is this thing going to hit? And then it eventually did, and it was a bit too late in the end. Will that happen here? Probably not, but I don't know. Nintendo's track record for console transitions from a very successful platform to the next gen, it hasn't been great. But this is under new leadership, so we'll see what they do.
Any thoughts on this one, Will?
I mean, I guess it makes sense because they're not directly competing with Microsoft or Sony in terms of trying to work on the same schedule. So they have a little bit more levity to say, well, it doesn't matter if the other box is going to come out, next year or the year after. We're just going to do it when it feels ready for us. And, they're still producing a lot of really nice games on the Switch that are taking full advantage of that hardware. So I don't think there's any, huge reason to launch before they're ready. And I think everyone would rather see, a console that comes out and immediately has great games and a lot to look forward to, rather than, having it come out and then say, okay, we've got this one game that's good and everything else is just back compat stuff. So I think it's fair enough.
Yeah, which is kind of ironic because assuming PlayStation 5 Pro does arrive this year, then there isn't really any kind of killer software that's going to be attached to it as such. There's no sort of killer app, so to speak. We've got Astrobot coming, but that's looking pretty awesome already just on the base PlayStation 5. So yeah, I guess when you're doing a full generational leap, though, things are quite different. And I think Nintendo has talked in the past about how nervous it is about this generational transition because the Switch has basically been such a tremendously successful console for them. Up there with the best, possibly the best. Not quite sure about that, but it's certainly been delivering the goods for them. I was hoping that, we would see a similar kind of marketing cadence to the original Switch, which would mean that we'd see Switch 2 before the end of the year and then possibly towards the end of Q1 of the next. But it looks as though that isn't happening and possibly wouldn't have happened anyway because, well, back in the day, Nintendo had nothing to lose by marketing Switch 1 while the Wii U was out because it was essentially a write-off at that point. So I guess things are going to be kind of more carefully handled this time around. And if it is about software, I think that's a perfectly valid reason not to just get the hardware out there and rely on enhanced versions of existing games. And I'm just hoping, and I think Nintendo has a pretty good track record of this, that, you know, we're actually going to see some surprises in terms of game launches. I think if we look back at the last Nintendo Direct, I think the key thing was that they still managed to surprise us with new content for this really aged platform, which I thought was quite great. So I'm assuming that they must have, you know, great stuff in the lineup for Switch 2. And if it needs more time, that's fine by me. I think, you know, there's so much excitement about Switch 2 because there's, you know, we've got an idea of the processor that's in it and what it's capable of, but we've got nothing else. Literally nothing. We don't know the makeup of the device, whether it's going to be doing anything different to the existing Switch. There are all manners of rumours going around at the moment. For example, the I think my favourite, John, is the reverse Wii U theory.
Oh, yeah. Where it's like, I guess the idea is that it functions wirelessly to the TV, where you would essentially be streaming or doing something where it's like, you know, instead of sending the game to the gamepad as the Wii U, it sends what's happening on the Switch 2 hardware to the TV. So I would imagine if such a thing were to come to pass, the quote unquote dock would be something that you plug into the TV and then it just connects to the Wii or to the Switch. Call it the Wii.
To the Wii?
To the shit.
Yeah, you need to have a Wii 2 for it to work.
To the Switch too. So I don't know. I mean, I could see them trying something like that, but the more I thought about that idea, the more I'm like, I don't love it because, for one, think about the power situation, right? Like, what kind of battery life? You'll be dealing with battery life concerns all the time if that's how it works. So you still want a dock where you can stick it in the dock and charge it, especially for people that mainly play docked. And it's just, I don't know. That doesn't seem like a great idea unless it's executed really well.
I think you're right. I mean, one of the key things that happened with the Switch was basically the docked mode opened up extra clocks, and it did so by, you know, basically having you running off mains power. The reverse Wii U scenario doesn't really accommodate that. I don't see how that would actually work. The other rumor we've been seeing is 2 fans in there, which, I mean,
why not
doesn't
3?
really say much. Yeah, you know.
Wow.
But, you know, you would expect to have some decent level of performance available particularly for dock play. I think that's still, I mean, we say it in every sort of direct where we talk about the Switch 2. The fundamental weakness of the Switch 1 was that the living room display experience wasn't particularly great on a lot of games.
Yeah.
And that's the other rumor that we've been hearing, that the clock differential between docked and mobile mode is actually much wider than it was before, which would potentially mean that you'd be able to throw more horsepower at the living room display experience. All I'll really say about that, it does make sense, but there does reach a point where you get diminishing returns of throwing power at silicon.
I'm thinking more like that would be beneficial for the cost of DLSS, for instance, right? Because computationally, it's not free. Let's say, you know, they have a lower res screen in the unit itself that you don't really need to use it to that level. But for the TV experience, you're going to want to push that up to get decent results, right? So it makes sense to throw extra horsepower at that specifically. Yeah.
But beyond that, I mean, yeah, obviously there's a lot of discussion, a lot of concern about when it's actually coming out. We were hoping to see it much sooner. All I can really say is that the silicon has been ready for years at this point. So, you know, hopefully we will see something soon. And, you know, I'm not really too concerned about the horsepower side of the equation because, you know, when you're looking at what developers have done with Tegra X1, you know, most recent example, Ace Combat 7. Did you get a chance to play it on Switch, John?
No, not yet. But obviously I watched Oliver's video and it is pretty astounding, I have to say. It genuinely looks better than, say, the Xbox One version.
Yeah,
in many
some
ways.
Respects for sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So like to be able to achieve that on the Switch is a super impressive achievement.
Yeah, I mean, when it is, I mean, we've been doing some Switch retrospectives recently because we are coming to the end of the generation. We did the best graphics on Switch from first-party developers. I think you've recorded a third-party
We
equivalent,
did,
right?
we did.
Which is almost like a celebration of the impossible ports.
In a way, yeah.
And what I would love to do as a kind of endpoint to that coverage is to actually get the guys who did, Panic Button, Saber Interactive, Rebellion North, to get those Switch developers
together
to talk about their experiences of developing for the Switch and how they managed to achieve those fantastic results. I think that would be a great way to send off the generation from a Digital Foundry perspective.
Agreed.
But Switch 2, well, I guess we're going to be waiting until next year just to hear any details to actually see some games at this point. But with that, let's move on. Okay, so there's weirdness happening in the world of Valve at the moment. There's a brand new game that they've developed called Deadlock. A lot of people are playing at the moment. I saw a report that 18,000 people were playing it concurrently at one point on Steam. So it's not exactly a secret game anymore. And yet it might as well be, because there's essentially been a media blackout on the game. You can't talk about it because there's kind of what you might call a NDA, which isn't really an NDA. It stopped a lot of people from actually talking about the game, except The Verge. Sean Hollister at The Verge figured out that you didn't actually have to agree to the NDA in order to access the game. So he didn't agree to the NDA, decided to play the game and report on it. And this has opened up a huge amount of controversy about whether that's sort of an ethical way to proceed. It turns out that Sean has had matchmaking privileges for Deadlock withdrawn, so he can't actually play the game anymore. I think at this point, we should say that we do have access to it, right, Will? I mean, everyone does at this point.
Oh, yeah, everyone, definitely.
Because, it's basically like if you have the game, you get a series of invites, right? And you can send it out to other people who can play the game.
Yeah, that's correct. So in theory, there's no reason to stop it spreading unless Valve specifically kind of clamps down on that. But I think they want people to be playing it.
Yeah, but they don't seemingly want the press to be talking about it, possibly because it's too soon. I don't know. And I can't ask you if it's too soon, Will, assuming you have played it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to say. I certainly wouldn't be able to say if that particular entry in my Steam list happened to have just updated.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it's a really strange situation because I think whenever there's this many people playing a game, people want to talk about it. People want to share their experiences. And normally you would expect that there would at least be some sort of private place where you could do that. Often if you're alpha testing or beta testing a game, you'll have access to a Discord or something where you can discuss it with employees or other players. But I don't think that that's a thing for Deadlock. So we're in this weird situation where in theory, you could write about it, you could stream it, you could do other things. But it seems like, I don't know if it's just for The Verge in particular, but it seems like there are some actions being taken against people who do those things. So we're in a strange holding pattern, I guess, until Valve decides to make it official.
Okay. I'm just going to read a quote from Sean Hollister's Verge piece. Bearing in mind I don't own the game and I haven't circumvented any NDA agreements. I'm just quoting a publicly available article. So what is Deadlock? It's a 6-on-6 shooter like the original Overwatch, where your team of heroes attempts to dominate a map by slowly wearing down the opposing team and pushing them back. But you're also leading an army of NPC grunts down 4 different lanes to destroy the opposing team's stationary defences, a little like Dota 2 or other MOBA games. So I think it's fair to say, John, that not having access to this game doesn't particularly upset you at the moment.
No, I actually just typed it into YouTube and there's video of it right here. Somebody just uploaded, so it seems to be out there anyway. So I'm completely baffled by this because it seems like anyone can access it. You don't have to sign an NDA, and there's video on YouTube. Like, what the heck is the deal here? Like, why are they acting this way about this game? To me, just looking at the visuals here, this at first I was like, wait, is this just Fortnite? But then no, this is actually Deadlock.
No, this is stylish.
It looks like Fortnite. It's got that same kind of look where it's just like cartoony characters with attitude running around, shooting each other, and there's colorful effects happening, and I will never play it.
I think that's a
That's
great
about
game. It reminds me
why
a
would-
lot more of TF2 and maybe a little Bioshock
ju-
Infinite. I think there's some good style there.
I never actually liked TF2.
Oh,
I mean, I think it's good. I just don't. I can't explain
loving
it.
this.
I just find them not fun to play.
This isn't your kind of game, John.
No,
this
okay.
is
Actually,
like,
you know what?
this is DF law at this point.
let
You
me
don't like these games.
Let me clarify it. Actually, I like these. I can enjoy games like this if I'm playing with people I know, but I don't enjoy playing with strangers. Period. Like, I just find it unpleasant and also unrewarding, because when you win, nobody knows or cares, and when you lose, you're just dealing with like unpleasant people. So there's like zero benefit to doing anything in these things to play with strangers. It's just, I don't like it. And that's, you know, a lot of people do, but I just find it not enjoyable. But if you get people together in a room and land it up, then you know what? Then this would probably be all right.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's possible.
Okay, fundamentally though, when I look back to the games I liked, it's like Quake 3 Arena, Unreal Tournament stuff, older stuff like that, Halo even. Like there's a hit reaction. You know, you fire your guns, they react as you'd expect. There's strategy there. When I look at games like this, I just see like numbers everywhere. It's like you're just pointing a reticle at a dude and holding a button until a bar drains, and you see numbers popping off, and then it's like you do it again. It just doesn't. I don't know. What am I missing here, Will?
Well, Will, you're well into your esports.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've played an uncomfortable number of hours of Counter-Strike, and
Counter-Strike I have enjoyed, I will say. I had some fun. Even with strangers, I had some fun with Counter-Strike in the past because it's very like intense, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very fast-paced once you start shooting, and there's a lot of challenge to getting the movement right and the shooting right, which I think is quite enjoyable. For this, it does look like there is quite a lot of nuance to it. Like, as you say, you are kind of holding a mouse cursor over someone until their numbers go away. Yep. But the movement is quite interesting. There's a lot of latitude for moving around in interesting and skilled ways, which I think is a great thing to bring over from Counter-Strike. I think the style of the game, even though you don't like it, I think it's kind of got at least a more consistent visual style than something like a Fortnite. And just all the iconography reminds me so much of TF2, and just brings me back to the days where I was on a LAN playing TF2 against people in the Computer Gaming Society at Bristol. So I think there's a lot of potential.
To be
here.
fair to it, looking at the colors and such, it does kind of have this look of like, what if you tried to simulate the Fortnite visual style but using Source?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, it's got softer colors. Some of the city stuff looks kind of like Half-Life 2-ish.
Yeah, definitely. I think you can find inspiration from basically all previous Valve titles here.
But, you know, anything I say on this should not be taken as a statement on its quality or appeal, by the way. Just to make that clear.
Yeah,
well,
for sure.
We got this supporter question from Agsma. Hi DF, the Deadlock debacle is genuinely funny to me, especially when Valve went through more damaging leaks and data breaches, most notably in 2003 when Half-Life 2 was leaked, and in 2020 when the Source Engine's source code was leaked and was a catalyst to the mass bot farming that made TF2 unplayable for a lot of people. Do you think people are blowing this out of proportion? This isn't even a single-player game, otherwise I'd get the outcry. Well, there has been an outcry specifically against Sean Hollister, who dared to press escape on an NDA prompt, and also his colleague Tom Warren, who actually shared the post. And it was quite amusing to see that Sean being banned from matchmaking seemed to escalate into a whole series of imaginary pieces of retribution that Valve had acted against the Verge, which I'm reliably informed never happened. So, I mean, what do you think, Will, about this concept of covering the game in the way Sean did? Did he cross a line?
I really don't think so. I think that, you know, basically he's well within his rights to say there's a journalistic interest to report on this information. It's clearly not a secret. It's not protected by any legal agreement that he signed up for. So I think it's fair enough that you can report on it, as anyone should feel, free to do so. I think it's equally fair that Valve banned him from matchmaking. I think that, clearly they're not yet at the stage where they want to involve press, and they're also their right. So
Yep,
I
true.
think, I think it's really funny that everyone got so up in arms about this, because ultimately I don't think it matters too much. Somebody was inevitably going to talk about it on some major website. It turned out to be The Verge. They got banned. Fair enough. I don't think there's much more to say beyond that. If they don't get access to Valve stuff in the future, that would be a shame. But I guess they must have weighed that up before publishing. So,
yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I mean, it's a guy doing his job. John.
I mean, I agree with what Will said. I think they did nothing wrong, and I think Valve also has the right to block people from it if they so desire. It's their thing.
Yeah.
So I can't really knock them for that, I guess, other than it seems a bit unpleasant, if you will.
Yeah, makes it a bit antagonistic, doesn't it?
It's weirdly antagonistic, and I just don't understand that, to be honest. Like, what Valve really gains from doing that? It doesn't seem like it would have bought them any positive press from like the community necessarily. So
Right.
I'm a little confused as to why they felt the need to take this tactic, because the fact is, like I said, you just go out there and you type this in and there's tons of footage out there. Maybe they're like trying to take it down really fast, but I'm seeing a lot. Like, this does not seem like a secret thing to me. I had no idea what this game looked like before we started recording today. I only just found out now why this topic was happening. So, so yeah, that's why it feels weird to me. It's like, what's the big deal?
Yeah, the concept of having so many concurrent players, which in turn means that, there's probably an order of magnitude more people out there who actually have the game.
Right.
I mean, what are you protecting at this point?
Especially if the buzz is largely positive. It seems like it is, right? Except for people that don't like these types of games, but you shouldn't listen to them.
Yeah, John.
Exactly. Do not listen to me on this. I'm just saying stuff, nonsense. But yeah, I mean, it is what it is, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to end the discussion on this one. It is what it is.
Yep.
It's out there. I mean, chances are you might even be playing it directly after listening to this direct.
Go for it.
Okay, let's move on. Interesting story emerged this week that the next and final episode, I think, possibly in the Final Fantasy remake, Final Fantasy 7 remake trilogy, could be shifting from Unreal Engine 4, which the previous two entries have used, onto Unreal Engine 5. Yeah, I think it's a pretty good idea, and I think John agrees, and we'll tell you why.
I mean, fundamentally, UE5 and UE4 are the same engine. It's just that UE5 adds additional features such as Lumen and Nanite and all that were not available in Unreal Engine 4. And usually when tackling new game projects in Unreal, you would expect them to kind of move on to the next iteration before locking it down and going with it. I mean, I could see an argument for sticking with UE4 only because they know they're familiar with it, but at the same time, it feels like this is a game that's not going to ship for some years. It would behoove them to sort of get on board with more recent versions, right?
Yeah.
And those technologies very specifically, I think, could help them a lot. Lighting, Lumen would be awesome, but it's not like 100% something that they would necessarily need to embrace. But I feel like the virtualized geometry stuff could be very useful because they went for sort of a density in the assets in Rebirth. But if you actually looked closely at anything, it didn't really hold up very well, which is specifically the type of problem that Nanite seeks to solve, right? Is to allow for granular geometric detail at close proximity. So I think that would be a huge thing for them to do it. So logically speaking, this all makes sense to me. But obviously that also means the developer's going to have to change their workflow to match these new technologies, because jumping to something like Nanite, it's not trivial. And it's you do have to change the way assets are generated and the way you work in the editor and everything. It's not a simple switch, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, and I think there's probably going to be the the concept that Unreal Engine 4 support itself might be diminished or even deprecated during the development period of the third part of this trilogy. I mean, the first one came out in 2020. Just reading the Video Games Chronicle report here, the second part, 2024. So realistically, we shouldn't be expecting it until 2028 anyway.
Now, just to interject though, to be fair though, if you look back, it depends on how much customizing they've done to the engine. Like take NetherRealm, for instance, up until Mortal Kombat 1, they stuck with their UE3 derived variant of Unreal Engine, right? So like up through Injustice 2, Mortal Kombat 11, those were both shipped on that Unreal Engine 3 derived technology. It's only with MK1 that they actually shifted then to UE4.
Yeah, you're quite right. Another classic example is Arkham Knight, right? Which stuck on a not very old Unreal Engine.
Exactly. And then
Unreal Engine 3.
When that, company made the switch to UE4,
they did a lot of work on it to get it running at 60.
There's some good looking stuff in there, but yeah, I think Arkham Knight kind of still wins out visually speaking. But so, I mean, it's feasible for them to stick with UE4, but I think it would behoove them to move forward.
Will, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think if it looks like it's going to take about as much time and effort to switch versus not, then they should switch. Because, you are going to be saving some time in terms of not having to manually place lights, not having to, manually do LODs and stuff like that, right? So there are some time savings associated with a lot of those UE5 technologies. And yeah, I guess it does take time to get up to speed with that and to make use of all of those features without hurting performance and without, relying too heavily on upscaling and all that other classic stuff. But yeah, I mean, if the game's coming out in 2027 or 2028, then yeah, I think it makes sense to just take the hit initially and then hope that you'll kind of, make up any lost time by working more efficiently in the time until then.
Yeah, actually, John, I was just reminded that we recently put out a piece of content which was the interview with Ninja Theory on Hellblade 2, which actually covers the scenario of how they moved from Unreal Engine 4 to Unreal Engine 5.
Right.
And it didn't get a huge amount of views because it was late, but I do recommend listening to that interview because it's a fascinating insight into the whole concept of moving between those two iterations of Unreal Engine and the advantages that they had by moving to the new technology, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I guess one of the eye-opening things we learned from there is that they were using UE4 pretty late up into the development cycle.
Yeah.
That original Giants demo that they first showed off, that was done in UE4. So, I was surprised to learn that. So they made the transition pretty late, but when they did, that interview talks about it. They went through that whole process of shifting their workflow and they successfully did it. Now, obviously it's a much smaller game in terms of scope versus, something like Rebirth is a gigantic game, very big, very different scope compared to Hellblade 2. So that does change things a bit, but I still think they can pull it off.
Cool. Okay, great stuff. I do recommend checking out that interview, by the way. Possibly overlooked, but man, there's some great stories in there and some great technical details.
Yeah, so I think so too.
Absolutely do check that out. Okay, let's move on to our next story. Before we begin this story, I'm just going to get straight into the supporter questions. This one from 1040 STF. John, have you watched the Guinness World Record video for the most consoles plugged into a TV? Any comment on it? On my side, I was expecting Linus to show up at the end and shout, "Okay, I let you keep 10 of them. The others must go." And so that would actually be he's got to let go 434 different consoles. This one from Snorlax Jobless in block capitals. I don't do shouting. John X My Life in Gaming analysis of the 444 consoles on a TV when?
Never.
This is... You say that, but I think Try turned up in the Discord to talk about it.
Well, okay. I guess I feel like I need to meet this person and see their setup before I can actually analyze it.
This is the kind of nuts thing that we love, right?
So yeah, what he's achieved here is pretty interesting and insane to actually go to this effort. Because yeah, he's essentially hooked up every possible variant and console that he could find. Like it seems to me like he specifically hunted down every variant in order to have all of these things running on a single screen. Although the first comment I would make is I'm surprised that a man capable of funding all this has a screen like that, essentially, which I feel like the TV kind of lets it down a little bit.
Wow.
Okay.
I would have expected like a 97-inch OLED or something in there.
Fair point.
Right? Like that's what you expect when you see this.
I mean, maybe it's just difficult to get to the TV after you've piled all the game consoles and the table in front. Maybe he's like, well, I would upgrade it, but I had to move everything, unplug everything. Ugh.
So the way so I guess the first thing to note is this whole setup is focused on digital scaling. So even the retro stuff, it's all piped through HDMI. So, and he sent it all to this singular TV. And it seems like the real feat here, there's actually two things that stick out to me. First of all, power management, handling the electricity supply for all of these different machines in a safe manner. Well, presuming it's safe. That's tricky by itself. And I'm sure it's very, very complicated, there. But then also just the general wiring is the other major part. Getting everything into the multitude of HDMI splitters. He actually has what looks like an Excel sheet on a computer where he's
a 32 by 9 inch monitor by the look of it.
Yeah, but he's running it in like 16 by 9, so everything's really stretched for some reason.
Okay.
I'm not sure why. But yeah, you actually reference that spreadsheet to determine like which switchers you need to turn on to get to the game.
Wow.
Which is I guess when you're powering 440, is it 444 maybe
444
systems? Yeah, that's what are you gonna do, right? Like that's what it comes down to. I assume there must be some automatic switching for analog signals, possibly to different scalars and such. I would imagine. It's not 100% clear to me how all of that works, just based on this clip here. But it's super, super, super dense and complicated. I mean, it's just, I respect this dude for going for it, because I think it's just doing this, actually getting this to work is a huge feat.
I think the logistics of this are really impressive. Somehow piping through 444 consoles to one screen is quite impressive. I'm not quite sure how he's done it, particularly as there's so many analog sources involved. So I'm assuming there must be like a bank of RetroTinks or similar, or modded consoles with HDMI outputs where available.
So I already know there's a lot of different SCART switches, for instance, that you can use and other switches as well that are all automatic, and you can link them all together. So you can get like a friend of mine here has like a 32 input SCART setup going on, and it's all automatic, right? So it just sends out that singular analog output from the end of the SCART chain. So I would assume that for all the analog systems, that's basically what he's doing. It's just making it so like he's using these automatic kind of SCART switchers or other composite switchers or something to essentially automatically select that and then pipe it in through whatever scaler he's using. Because he didn't show the scaler in the video as far as I could see.
Right, okay.
I'm curious to what he's using. I would assume with the cache, he would have picked up some RetroTink 4Ks or something, but maybe not.
Mm-hmm. You'd think. But even so, just the concept of piping through 444 different units into a single screen, the amount of matrix units, splitters, is kind of like almost nuts. And maybe you do need an Excel spreadsheet just to navigate the kind of remotes that you're going to be needing to select the right piece of equipment.
Well, it looks like it's all manual kind of HDMI switchers with buttons on the front that you press. So you kind of got to figure out which buttons to press on all of these.
Amazing.
What can I say? It does sort of make it quite tricky then, therefore, in terms of actual quality of life. I don't know why I'm talking about this in this
I
way.
mean, I've done 20 something consoles on my setup at once, and
Right.
even that, it's really gets pretty complicated. Like, I have it pretty automated, but I feel like going beyond that it starts to introduce too much complexity into it. So I think this is probably the only way you can pull it off. It's just to document it and then reference that document, because there's no way you're going to be able to figure out what goes where without it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, of course, from the logistical side is all of those different power adapters, not interfering with the video signals, quite a feat, I would say.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, what do you make of this? How many systems have you got connected to your screen?
One. Yeah.
Well, you're short 443. That's just not good enough.
Yeah, true. I might have to change my setup slightly to accommodate that number. But I'm just thinking about like the gamepads as well. Like, surely a lot of these are going to be wired, so they're going to have like controller cables just dangling around and coming out all over the place.
I'm not sure what he's doing, but again, my local friend Klaus here, he put together this like sort of wireless receiver setup that allows him to use any controller on any console.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
So they're all plugged in on these different radio signals, and they all use their own custom dongles for each machine, and you just power on whatever controller you want, and it just works on any machine. So
That's
it completely
super cool.
removes that complexity. It's all just wireless. You just charge the controllers.
And also adds complexity, right?
It does.
It does. As well.
Once it's set up, though, it's really, really impressively seamless.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's.
Okay.
I mean, it's an amazing achievement, I think. I don't think we can maybe learn too much, but I mean, fair play. Like, absolutely fair play.
We can't learn too much.
Can't learn too
Nothing
much.
practical, anyway.
Yeah.
I would like to see the HDMI splitter situation in a bit more depth, but yeah, that's kind of about it. Okay, let's move on. Okay, interesting news story that actually cropped up this week, which I think is actually very welcome news in theory. Obviously, the recent announcement of Microsoft downsizing and the shuttering of various studios, the one that really stood out actually, no, it wasn't just one, but the concept that Microsoft would be closing down Tango Gameworks in particular didn't go down particularly well, especially in light of continued assurances from Microsoft that it really wanted to take the Japanese market seriously. So the idea of its premier Japanese studio actually being shuttered just didn't quite make sense. And then, of course, there was the conflict in messaging from executives regarding the success of Hi-Fi Rush, which, you think should have put Tango Gameworks, into safety, if you like.
Right.
It didn't happen. It was shut down, and everyone was kind of wondering what would happen next. We now know what has happened next. Tango Gameworks will continue. It is not shutting down. Microsoft seems to have, I'm not sure whether sold, but regardless, PUBG publisher Krafton has acquired Tango Gameworks and apparently the Hi-Fi Rush IP. On the face of it, John, this is absolutely fantastic news, right?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. It seems like, I'd be curious to see how many people from the studio ended up transitioning to new jobs and how many are going to be returning. But it sounds on the surface to be like good news all around. This is only good news, I guess, because the other alternative was they shut down. But I think it's great that somebody stepped up with the cash to essentially keep them running, keep that office going. Yeah. It only makes sense. They were extremely talented.
Yeah. Hopefully it is a happy ending for Tango Gameworks, because it there just seemed to be an element of injustice about it all that really upset a lot of people, including us,
Yeah, big time.
Obviously raised a lot of questions about what Microsoft's strategy actually is, why this happened. We still don't really know that, because it was all couched within an existing narrative that everything was brilliant with Tango, but obviously it wasn't quite what Microsoft wanted. Will, thoughts?
I mean, yeah, I don't think I have anything particularly new to add. I think it's wonderful that these developers are able to continue hopefully making great games. I hope that nobody important has left and gone somewhere else. I really hope a lot of that original team can stay together. But yeah, we'll see how it goes, I suppose.
Okay, so on the face of it, this is absolutely fantastic news because obviously we've got a lot of respect for Tango Gameworks and we'd like to see more from them. I guess one thing which is slightly concerning me is the fact that it's Krafton that's picked them up, because there's been a lot of negative press recently about how the release of the Callisto Protocol happened. And there's talk of the developer being forced to release it early, which I think we can all say had a particular impact on the quality of the game at launch. It took a while to get it into shape, and I'd say that even now the PC version isn't in shape. But even so, maybe that's just an isolated thing. But the good news is that Tango is still in business, which is fantastic. And hopefully you're right. Hopefully that people who have departed will return. Just a good news story, generally, hopefully.
Yeah,
I agree.
Let's move on.
Let's hope.
Okay, next news story. Basically, this seems to be like happening every few weeks, every couple of months, but rumours abounded on X/Twitter this week that Forza Horizon 5 would be coming to PlayStation consoles. I actually put on the docket coming to Xbox, which would certainly be a hugely unexpected turn of events.
Big if
Let's go with a supporter question, first of all, from Fiddler_2K, which is basically addressing, the fact that this topic just seems to keep on coming back. Should Microsoft rip off the proverbial quote-unquote band-aid and be upfront/transparent about their porting plans in the here and now? They would probably receive more concentrated flack, but I feel it would be better for the Xbox brand in the long term rather than these constant doom cycles. We can't really comment on whether Forza Horizon 5 is coming to PlayStation consoles, but I'd say it's probably likely. Why not? The game's been out for a few years now. It's an excellent game. I don't think Microsoft stands to lose anything by putting it onto PlayStation in the same way they didn't really lose anything by expanding the Sea of Thieves community. But there is always this kind of wave of rumours, and they're always the same. And I think possibly the reason it continues, that there is this doom cycle, as Fiddler_2K puts it, is that we still don't really have a firm idea on strategy of what Microsoft is going to be doing going forward. From my perspective, the firm is a multi-platform publisher at this point. And the fact that they're acquiring studios that are multi-platform in nature and have to be for their financial survival, Activision Blizzard King, for example, it basically means that the majority of their content is going out onto all systems anyway. So, a few titles here and there isn't going to really make much difference, but could to the Microsoft bottom line. John, what's your thought on this?
Yeah, I think he's probably right in that it would make sense to quote unquote rip off the proverbial band-aid at this point, because it does feel like they are simply moving into the direction of becoming the biggest publisher in the world for games, or one of them. Like, that seems to be the goal now. It seems like it has shifted from, we make the Xbox. They also make the Xbox, but they are more focused on, we want to be the biggest publisher. They put out big games on every platform and bring in the most money. And I really think, I feel like all their acquisitions kind of tipped the scales in that way, where when you have so much publishing power, you can't really afford to limit it to just one platform, especially when that platform is not like the market leader. I think if Xbox had absolutely decimated the competition and become like the market leader, then maybe there's an argument there, but that's not where we're at right now. And I think this is their path to make the business significantly more profitable, no doubt. This is Microsoft. That's what they do. They're very good at making lots of money, I would say, right? And that's ultimately what you need to do to survive in this business anyway. And that seems to be the focus. Now, I'm curious to see, though, if they really do go 100% in on this, whether we'll start to see some of the classic Xbox IP ever really brought over. But I suspect that it's not unlikely.
Right.
Right.
Will?
Yeah, just to echo what John said, I think it makes sense to be more open. I think in general there's perhaps a lack of clear leadership at the moment in terms of, game porting and game releases specifically. And I feel like people who are Xbox fans would, maybe be a bit stung by that. But I think ultimately it's better to say, you know what, we will have our own exclusive games, but they will eventually come to other platforms, and that's okay. I think that's fair enough. In terms of Forza Horizon 5 specifically, it's an amazing game. It's probably one of the best Microsoft games that they've ever done.
Yep.
So it should be on more places.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. I feel like it's the rise of Game Pass, especially, makes this easy for them to want to do, because you either subscribe to their service, which is good for them, or you're spending money full price on another platform. Right? Either way, they win. I mean, you look at the sales of Sea of Thieves on PlayStation, they were extremely positive, and I'm sure they were very happy with those results. So either way, whether you're playing on an Xbox, you're playing on a PC, you're streaming something on your phone, you're using one of their, I guess, Surface. Do they still use the Surface branding at this point?
Yep.
I think they do.
I think they do, yeah.
I bought a Surface.
So, or, a PlayStation or a Switch, like, they're just everywhere. And I think that's where they want to be. And I think that specifically is something that they can do that Sony and Nintendo either won't or can't follow them on.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this is a tricky one, because on the face of it, it does seem pretty straightforward, right? It's like you can either play these games on your PlayStation and pay $70, or you can subscribe to Game Pass. Now, obviously, the tricky thing is that you can't subscribe to Game Pass on a Nintendo or a PlayStation console, right? So, I still think Microsoft needs a vehicle for Game Pass that is easily accessible, that is of a high quality, and that does basically mean you need to make an Xbox. And the counter argument to that is, well, why don't I just buy a PlayStation where I can enjoy Sony games and Microsoft games, because they're coming anyway? And I think that's possibly why the mid to long-term strategy is to change the nature of what an Xbox actually is, and to make it more of a PC-style device, so you don't miss out on those games if you don't want to. I think that's actually probably quite a good strategy, but what it does mean is that it doesn't really help things right now with the existing hardware that they've got.
It's tough.
So, and it does make it really difficult to say, right, okay, we're going to put out Forza Horizon 5 on PlayStation, because it does diminish the need to buy the machine that they've got out at the moment. But mid to long term, the strategy just kind of makes sense. And it does seem to be the case that certainly, the stuff that Tom Warren's been reporting on regarding the marketing of Xboxes in Europe, they're basically pulling back on marketing those boxes. That's not a great look, but I think that there is some sort of long-term strategy in place here. And we've only got access to, well, let's see what it is. It's basically reports from The Verge, and Windows Central, and it's kind of like these enigmatic statements from Phil, right? From Phil Spencer, for example. He's talking about the concept of the subsidized console model not really working anymore. It's not expanding the audience. But at the same time, I think you probably need some kind of subsidized console in order to be a focal point for Game Pass subscriptions, because it doesn't seem to be gaining that much traction on PC. It's really tricky, and maybe there has to be some kind of outline of the strategy from Microsoft at some point. The question is, when do you actually announce that to the world?
I know.
I would say when you have new hardware, perhaps.
Yeah.
Which is years off.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I do think we're probably going to be seeing more games on PlayStation, which does make things awkward, and it does mean that there has to be some sort of decent messaging going out there. And I do think these rumours need to be sort of nipped in the bud, just by knowing exactly what's going to happen. What is Microsoft's plan for the next couple of years?
The comment's really interesting, though, because subsidized box model clearly still works. It's just not working for them anymore.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that's the thing, right? What do you do if it's not working for you? I think the main issue has obviously been delivery of content, delivery of high quality games over the last few years. I mean, the reason we're still talking about Forza Horizon 5 is that, it was like the kind of premium top end AAA experience that you kind of expect from a console. And Microsoft has failed to deliver those consistently over the last few years. Which has in turn made things really difficult for Xbox consoles, and in turn made things really difficult for expanding the reach of Game Pass, which I guess is maybe one of the reasons why we had the ABK acquisition.
But yeah, I mean, I guess that's just kind of where we are at the moment. We're just gonna have to wait and see. Like, they're in that awkward transition phase, I guess. If their plan is indeed to become the biggest publisher rather than a specific console provider, or as like chief console provider, then they have to transition at some point, right?
Absolutely. Okay. Well, maybe we'll start to see some shift in strategy, and certainly in terms of communication at Gamescom next week. But with that, let's move on to our final news topic. This is really positive news, actually. It looks as though SteamOS is coming to the Asus ROG Ally, and other Windows-based handhelds. Simultaneously, there was the announcement this week of revisions to the Xbox Game Bar within Windows, which is designed to make navigation around Windows on a Windows-based handheld a lot better. And I've actually got a couple of supporter questions about this. Hello, DF crew. This one's from Anxiously Chronoed Figured. With SteamOS coming to other handheld devices, what do you think would be the main selling point of the Microsoft X-Boy? Now you can pretty much choose between a console-like experience, Steam Deck, and a more powerful device you can use for Game Pass, albeit running a clunky OS. With this line going to be blurred in the future, how do you think Microsoft would advertise their device? They would need something extra to sell it, wouldn't they? Cheers and have a good weekend! ! Alexander Seidel says, regardless of when SteamOS will be available on other handhelds, what would be your level of excitement for a desktop release of SteamOS? John, let's go to you first on this one, more generally about the idea of SteamOS coming to Windows-based handhelds. I mean, you don't really have a huge amount of experience with these things, do you? But
no.
Basically, the key reasons why Steam Deck works is because it is actually navigable. It's not a desktop OS that's been shoehorned into a mobile device. So it can only be a good thing, really, right?
Well, in a way it is, because there's Linux, right? But they have this beautiful shell front-end system that makes it operate like a console, and that's fundamentally the difference, right? It sleeps like a switch. It has this like universal menus you can bring up to engage various settings that works across all the different games. It's the closest thing I've seen in the PC space to actually delivering a console-like experience with PC titles, which I think is honestly outstanding. And you can still get to the Linux desktop if you want to tweak stuff, which makes it different from a normal console. Obviously, as you kind of hinted there, the problem with the Windows handhelds is that Windows doesn't have an equivalent to the SteamOS front-end interface. I mean, they try to put in their different things like Armory Crate and such, right? But they're just not. It's not at the same level. It doesn't have that same hardware, that connection to the base hardware, right? That allows those features to work as well as they do. So if they're able to get SteamOS to work the same way it does on a Steam Deck on these machines, then I feel like that's actually game changing for those machines. And I don't think there's much of a risk to Valve there either, because they do tend to be more expensive, right? Than the Steam Deck.
The other thing, of course, is that, regardless of where you're playing your games, you're buying them on Steam.
Yeah, you're using Steam SteamOS. Exactly. So to me, it's all a win. And it also, I guess from Valve's perspective, it pushes more people to embrace Linux. Like I've used Linux more because of the Steam Deck than I have in a while, just because it's there and it works really well.
I think it's fair to say for most people, there's no need to use Linux unless you've got a Steam Deck.
Correct. Yeah. And so if they're starting to get SteamOS onto more devices through this way, it might increase that. which is why the idea of it coming to, I mean, we've had the Steam machines, but I actually like the idea of like a SteamOS install for custom hardware, because you can make some pretty slick, small little like living room PCs. You know, there's some beautiful cases out there, and just having everything consolidated into SteamOS on such a box really turns it into a PC console in a way that I think is super appealing.
Yeah, that was also the failure point of the Steam machines back in the day, really, is that, there just wasn't really a reason to run games through Linux.
Now there is. Proton is incredible. If you're using Steam, everything syncs between it. It really just behaves like a console at that point, and it would allow you to operate it like you have your desktop living room SteamOS games, and then you want to pick it up and play on the Steam Deck. It should all be very seamless, which is very appealing. I think it's cool.
Will, what's your reaction to this?
I mean, yeah, it's hugely positive. I think we kind of expected things were going in this direction. Valve have always been very open in saying that, they want to expand it and, have SteamOS available on other devices, because ultimately they can only make, so many variations of the Steam Deck, right? And one of the best things about the PC ecosystem in general is that there's such a diversity of design, specifications, that kind of thing. So I think it makes sense to open it up. Obviously, there's a question that if you start to put it on a device which is quite different to a Steam Deck, can you still benefit from the performance being quite reliable? Is it more difficult to have, the shader compilation stuff that they do just work out of the box? So I think
I'm not sure it would work.
Yeah.
Because they're downloading the Steam Deck specific shader compilations, so I'm not sure whether they can roll that out for other hardware. It's a question worth asking, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, there are alternatives out now, like Bazites, that basically do the same thing, which is, the idea is to have a viable alternative to Windows 11 for handhelds, and that is, Linux and SteamOS bits. But I just think the idea that Valve itself is producing a distribution that you can use on these devices that's been what you might call officially validated, I think that has a great degree of value, and actually people will be more inclined to try it out. So I think that's actually pretty good. I noticed, was it Will, did you add that they've added Steam Deck OLED Windows drivers? Because that's been an issue for some time now, hasn't it? Where there's just been missing support for various bits of technology within the handheld.
Yeah, absolutely. So the OLED version is the one that you would definitely get if you didn't have an LCD model already. You'd want the OLED because it has a lot of advantages. But previously, a lot of core functionality wasn't working in Windows, so it was basically only a SteamOS device. It seems like there's still some restrictions, like it won't play sound out of the speakers, but you could use a Bluetooth headset or plug in a headset and it would work. Okay. And there's no dual boot support, so you couldn't have SteamOS and Windows. But obviously, this is another very positive step, and it seems like we're going to get to a point where you'll have free choice of Steam or Windows, depending on whether, on either Valve hardware or any other hardware, which is going to be a really nice place to be.
Let's tackle these questions quite quickly. The idea of the Xbox handheld, it's a tricky one because we don't know anything about it when it's going to arrive, really. So, we can't really comment about it. What I will say is that there will be an element of competition between Valve and Microsoft for, who basically owns the handheld PC market. And a handheld Xbox that does have Steam functionality, I think that's got a pretty compelling proposition to it. The question is really how well PC integration outside of the Xbox ecosystem is going to work, because the lure of Steam is pretty much all-encompassing, right?
Absolutely.
How excited are we about a desktop release of SteamOS? Well, you can run Bazite on a Windows PC, but it may well be the case that what Valve is doing with the ROG Ally will also work on desktops. It's basically, what's the desktop going to be? Because, mastering the living room, so to speak, does require actually having a console-like form factor as well as the OS to get the job done.
Well, if you want to be the true master of the living room, you need a master system.
Yeah, I don't think so, John.
It's right there in the name.
Yeah, I guess so.
Any final thoughts on this? John, you've had yours. Will?
Yeah, I'm just really happy. I really like tinkering with Linux, and if there's another great, setup for gaming Linux distribution out there, I think that's only going to be a good thing, right?
Yeah, I think going back to the ROG Ally X, ROG Ally X rather, it's a fantastic piece of machinery. It's a really good handheld. It solves a lot of the problems that the Steam Deck OLED does have. Simply that its performance level isn't quite good enough for a number of games. So, the idea that you can actually have possibly the best of both worlds, a cutting edge handheld that does actually have all of the quality of life niceties of SteamOS, it can only be a good thing. And there is a pitch battle for the handheld PC marketplace, I would say, because at this point I think millions of Steam Decks have been sold, which I think is pretty fantastic. Maybe a low amount of millions, but it's still a device that people really want. Mm-hmm. And Valve have delivered some great hardware. So, the gauntlet has been thrown down, and whatever Microsoft comes up with the X-Boy.
The X-Boy.
Name not final.
Yeah, name not final. I can't wait to see what they got. Okay, so that's the end of the news. So at this point, it's the time where we plough on into supporter Q&A, which is the part of the show where every week we ask our supporters on Patreon for their questions, comments, and we're going to kick off with this one from Diego El Rey. It's still on Microsoft. Hello, DF. With the talk of Xbox going more multi-platform, what becomes the purpose of the actual box? I have all the boxes and a 4090 PC, and even right now, the only thing my Series X can do that nothing else can do is play a few console-only Game Pass games and play Fable 2. What is the purpose of continuing to make hardware at that point? Should Microsoft just strike a deal with Game Pass on PlayStation or Nintendo? Also, aside from Killer Instinct needing to come to the de facto home of fighting games, PlayStation, is there anything from Microsoft that you're particularly looking forward to coming to PlayStation and or Switch 2? I'm just going to quickly sort of weigh in with my thoughts there. As I said earlier, you need a focal point for Game Pass, right? And the concept that it's a PlayStation has significant financial implications for Microsoft, which they probably don't want. And to be fair, PlayStation probably wouldn't want either, because it's not just about competing for revenue, although of course that's of crucial importance. It's about competing for time. And if you've got a Sony platform that's hosting a Microsoft subscription service, I don't see how that can be a good thing for PlayStation, particularly when they have their own competing subscription service. So that's why I think they need a box, and it has to be a good box. It has to be a good value box. And we kind of got an idea from Microsoft about what those boxes are going to be. It's going to be a handheld and an ultra high-end console. But I think it's still going to have to be a good value. John, what do you think?
Well, first of all, he's questioning the purpose of the actual box while he has a 4090 equipped PC, which
that isn't an ideal scenario, is it?
No, most people aren't going to have that, and I think the Xbox itself it's an easy to use box that works in your living room and doesn't cost an arm and a leg. That's like a quarter or a third of the cost of a 4090, the Xbox itself. Yeah. So I think having a centralized box that's easy to use is still like an important thing for a lot of people. It just doesn't fit those that have a powerful PC and the other consoles. Then maybe a Series X doesn't actually make any sense there. But that's not going to be everybody. So, And then I completely agree with your take on the Game Pass stuff. I don't think it's coming to PlayStation and Nintendo anytime soon. It doesn't really make sense for any of them, I would say. Which then in turn fuels the need for having their own vehicle for it, which is the Xbox. So, which again, that's another selling point. It's like, hey, you have this box, you can get on this service, and it's an affordable way to play a lot of cool games. And there's going to be a lot of people that maybe they like gaming, but not so much that they want to go spend out $70 on games they want to play, and they would be perfectly happy with a service like this.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, any PC could be the Game Pass box, but the point is that, actually building a PC is pretty daunting and expensive.
A lot of people aren't going to want to do that. And the pre-built ones, they're going to be a lot more expensive than an Xbox to get similar kind of performance, right?
Yeah. And also, well, our particular dislike of the Xbox app and the Microsoft Store, that comment isn't going away. Will, why do Microsoft need an Xbox?
Well, for all the reasons that we've just mentioned.
It's fair enough.
I think it's pretty straightforward. This is the status quo for now. It might change in the future that they just release a PC that has an Xbox like front end, but otherwise you can crack it open and play your own stuff. But I think that's not going to happen anytime soon. And for the moment, you need to have a box that people can buy. Does have performance, enough to mean that you don't have to worry about this game isn't going to run well. It's going to look way better on PlayStation, anything like that. Just needs to be cheap, affordable, and do the business. And right now they have that. So, yeah.
In theory, the PC should have been the home of Game Pass, really, simply because of the sheer volume of PCs out there. But for whatever reason, growth hasn't been stratospheric for Game Pass PC. So I do think they're going to need a box, a Game Pass box, which is an Xbox.
Yep.
I think that's it. Next question, this one from Eric Benoit. If Microsoft wants to put exclusives on PlayStation platforms, wouldn't putting older Xbox titles on the Nintendo Switch and the Switch 2 when it comes out in 2020, whenever, be a good move? Doom 3 looks great on the Switch OLED, and I think titles like Crimson Sky, Blue Dragon, and even Halo 1 or 2, dare I say it, would play well on the handheld. If they're serious about a handheld device of their own, maybe they wouldn't do this. But what do you think, gentlemen, think? John, they've already experimented with some success by putting games on Nintendo Switch. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't continue to do that as long as there's a market worth addressing there.
Yeah, I would assume so. The titles he's specifically talking about are it's backwards compatible stuff, which I think actually is a great case for their handheld system. As he noted, if they have their own handheld system, opening that up to like 360 and original Xbox titles, that makes a lot of sense. That would be really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but yeah, I mean, they're pretty much doing exactly this already. Maybe not at the speed he would like to see, but there are Xbox games showing up on Switch already. So I assume it will continue.
Backwards compatibility engines running on the existing Switch is probably asking a bit too much.
Yeah, I don't think that's feasible at all,
Switch
actually.
2?
I mean, the only one I'm surprised we haven't seen yet is something like the Master Chief Collection on Switch.
Yeah, that'd be great, actually.
The only difficulty there would be specifically the anniversary mode of Halo 2 would probably be a bridge too far for Switch. But everything else should be doable.
Okay, cool. Will, any thoughts?
No, not particularly. I think it's it would be really cool to see a lot of these older titles just get more of an audience. And I think, if the Switch 2 comes out and it has the power to do this back-compat stuff way better, then it would be super cool of Microsoft to, release a lot of these, either on some kind of, well, I guess streaming service or whatever wouldn't really make sense. But, put them out in collections or, just bring them over one by one would be great.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. This one comes from Skyrim Super Championship Turbo Edition 2. I think I've mentioned before he's missed out hyper fighting. But anyway, the question is, with Switch 2 being held captive in a Kyoto warehouse until mid-2025, PS5 Pro set to deliver the 30 FPS 8K experience nobody asked for, Xbox deciding that selling PS5s is its core strategy and PC remaining largely inaccessible to filthy casuals. What does the DF audience have to look forward to in 2025? Please cheer me up. PS, GTA 6 will not be a 2025 release date or expectations. You heard it here first. Well, that's pretty much a litany of potential disasters for our business model.
Absolutely, yeah.
I do like the idea that the Switch 2 is being held captive, presumably against its will, in a Kyoto warehouse. I think there's a lot to look forward to in 2025. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just looking at PC releases coming up, and stuff like the new Doom game looks incredible.
Hmm.
There's going to be a new Civilization, which has been a long time coming.
Hmm.
Path of Exile 2, Fable. It's like lots of cool and interesting stuff. And, as well as just software, the hardware side of things could actually be quite spicy because we'll get, new Intel graphics cards that might be a bit more competitive. That would be really interesting. I think there's
Yeah.
high expectations for 50 series NVIDIA graphics cards.
Yep.
Presumably there'll be new AMD stuff. And then, after the maybe underwhelming Ryzen 9000 launch, there's the potential for Intel to do something quite interesting with their next generation. So plenty to look forward to, I'd say.
Yeah. John, what are you looking forward to?
I mean, he jokes, but like, I think the Switch 2 will be out in 2025, and the PS5 Pro should already be out as well. And I don't think it's a 8K 30 FPS machine at all. I don't really think that's the purpose. I mean, this stuff, I'm hoping that we'll see like Death Stranding 2 maybe show up in 2025. That'd be
great. Yeah.
That'd be nice. I'm very much looking forward to that. You already mentioned Doom: The Dark Ages. Isn't that, even though I'm so done with Marvel stuff, the Rise of Hydra still looks pretty nuts, and I'm curious to see what they do there, because there's Metroid Prime 4, of course. I mean, there's plenty of stuff on the horizon, and a lot of times things just kind of come out of nowhere, or you don't know until it gets closer when it's actually going to hit. So I think between all the stuff Will mentioned and that, I think there's plenty to be excited about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing will be what happens with NVIDIA and 50 series, because I don't know, 40 series looked a lot like Turing to me, where, that was the RTX 220 series, where, it came out, it was too expensive on the upper tiers, and they kind of course corrected with a mid-generation refresh, which is what they did with Ada as well.
Mm-hmm.
But then when it came to Ampere, they actually doubled down on value and delivered good performance there. And I think possibly, maybe they'll be aiming to do something about price this time as well. So, and if we look at what the 4060 is doing, at the bottom end, so to speak, if that can be made cheaper, great. If that sort of price point can get more memory and more performance, that would be great. I think the filthy casuals would be quite okay, possibly, if that all comes to pass. We've actually seen quite a lot of, in fact, probably the most heated competition, I think, in the sort of $300 price point range in the GPU side of things. So, hopefully that will continue. Because they're delivering pretty good performance, I would say. It's just the memory side of things that kind of bothers me. But yeah, I think 2025 is going to be pretty good all round for us. Let's move on to the next question. This question comes from Helen X. Hello, everyone. After being a little amazed at how well Cyberpunk runs and how good it looks on the Steam Deck, I've had the thought that it should likely be a surprise Switch 2 launch title. Can you think of any other quote-unquote surprise games that could launch with the Switch 2 based on your experiences with handheld PCs? That's actually a really interesting point, Will, because Cyberpunk does run relatively well on a Steam Deck. We kind of pegged it as being like a portable PlayStation 4, but actually Cyberpunk runs a lot better on the Steam Deck than it does on the PlayStation 4. So I think, sort of mapping that across to Switch 2, there's probably a big bunch of games that would probably do rather well. As to whether there'd be launch titles, I don't know, but, obvious examples would be Control from Remedy. That just makes sense.
Yeah.
Any other ones you can think of?
I mean, I guess Elden Ring would be pretty cool.
Yep. Elden Ring with all the DLC.
Diablo, Horizon, a lot of like really nice open world games have come out, that are challenging and too big for Switch potentially. So
wait,
it would be cool
when you say Horizon, what Horizon do you mean?
Forbidden West, I guess.
Oh,
that would be interesting.
I can't imagine Sony doing that, to be honest.
No, not as a launch title for sure, but
no, period.
Well, it's on PC, right? So anything is possible.
What do you make of the Lego Horizon, though? That is coming to Switch, and
yeah, exactly.
Sony involvement.
Oh, that's a good point.
It's a different thing, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not their
really
core.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Example.
I mean, yeah.
I think with enough time, when enough time has passed, maybe they'll be less precious about it. I see what you're saying for sure, but
I see what you're saying, John, but I do think that Sony is looking to increase revenues, and I am unsure as to whether there is crossover, whether it diminishes PlayStation by having inferior Switch versions that are mobile, unless they have their own mobile. I think they're putting some serious thought into that.
Yeah,
and
maybe you're
they're
right.
going to be looking at Lego Horizon there. That's an interesting thought, though.
That's a good point.
But basically, I mean, if you just look back at all of the Digital Foundry Steam Deck coverage we've done since launch, I think those games could run just as well on the Steam Deck, possibly even better, bearing in mind that the developers would be targeting that specific piece of hardware. And it's going to have, the stuff like DLSS and ray tracing in there. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think Cyberpunk actually could run really well on Switch too.
Indeed.
In fact, I think it was one of the games that I did in my T239 target performance a video that I did a while back. And it seemed to run pretty well. But I just think, similar to the original Switch, possibly even more so, bearing in mind the more modern GPU, it's party time for the third parties for Switch 2. Yeah,
Big
definitely.
time. I mean, you look at stuff like Red Dead Redemption 2, for instance. They just released the Red Dead Redemption port on regular Switch, right? Makes sense. Rockstar games are timeless. Get that, or even freaking GTA 5 again. Because why the heck
I'm
not?
sure they'd love to get GTA.
If they had GTA 5 at launch with GTA Online and stuff, like, it doesn't matter how old it is, it would sell. People would go nuts for it. I also think it's a good opportunity for Capcom, because I think they would have loved to had all their RE engine games on Switch, but it's just not technically feasible. And now it might actually become feasible. So we could see some of the Resident Evil stuff show up, for instance, and anything else running on that new engine.
Okay. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Octolima. Hey, hello DF, exclamation point. Dedicated videos are for deep dives. So here, outside of those shackles, lay it on us. What are the random annoyances you have in modern gaming? PS5 not being able to output 120 with VR at all times. The plague that is improperly frame rate caps. The average graphics settings menu being bare bones with descriptions that do nothing to aid the user. The fact that so many PC games lack a simple internal resolution sliders. Go on. Actually, I could probably have a pretty good guess at what John would say, but let's kick off with Will. What are your sort of random annoyances in gaming?
I mean, I think basically all of them revolve around the Microsoft Store and the Xbox app just being incredibly unreliable. I think this is exacerbated by the fact that I'm usually benchmarking when I encounter this kind of stuff. But I feel like if Microsoft fixed that and then they just released, the next Xbox and it was just a PC and that was all sorted, I'd be super happy with that. But as it stands, every time I have to re-download a game or, think about reinstalling Windows because something hasn't installed properly, I just lose my crap. So that'd be one.
Yeah, I mean, my one's pretty straightforward. I mean, I like to game on PC, but the concept of stutter is just nuts. The concept that, it's there at all. I can understand why it's there. I don't understand why it isn't being picked up on during QA and being eliminated. Because it just doesn't really make sense to me. But, for the rest of the PC stuff, Alex made a video about the 13 ways to improve PC ports, and I back all of them. I don't think he did launchers within launchers, though. I did. That's just nuts. Whenever I load up Steam, I actually get EA Play loading up at the same time.
Oh, God.
Because I've got Jedi Survivor installed. Why? Stop it. John,
Jedi,
go for it.
Jedi, or what is it? Stutter Survivor?
No, Judder Survivor.
Judder Survivor, that's what it was. Judder Survivor, yeah. So, I mean, one of my current pet peeves remains the extremely uneven and relative lack of games supporting HDR, let alone HDR properly, because I think HDR is absolutely transformative when done well. Like, it's so beautiful. But I feel like the number of games supporting it is actually decreasing. And I don't know why, because there are more HDR displays out there than ever. OLEDs especially are taking off in a big way, even in the PC space. So what the heck? Get HDR in there, guys. Come on now.
I was going to say that my monitor has Dolby Vision even. And could I get that to work to mention it in a review? not, I mean, maybe one game actually supported it, but it's all really, really old stuff at this point.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
unless auto HDR just magically becomes amazing, and it is already good, and I'm really glad we have that as a tool. But yeah, it feels like nobody's really paying attention to the HDR experience on Windows, and that's a really big shame.
Yep.
Mm,
I would
yeah.
also throw in stuff like scaling of pixel assets and such is not always handled well, especially in games that use pixel art or like lower resolution artwork. Like lower resolutions can look a lot better when the scaling is done right. And a lot of times it's just not. It's like blurry bilinear upscale or something similar that kind of ruins the image quality. That always annoys me.
Mm-hmm. We could go on all day.
Yeah.
I think the issue is that we've talked about it at length in so many different directs at this point that we're at risk of covering old ground. But do watch Alex's video about how to improve PC ports, because I think, as we discussed in a direct a couple of weeks ago, there have been some genuine improvements, but there's still a lot of, dare I say it, low-hanging fruit that that isn't being sorted.
Low-hanging fruit in the here and now.
In the here and now. Bespoke low-hanging fruit. Okay. Let's move on to our final question. This question comes from Lil John.
Without the East Side Boys, unfortunately.
And his question is this. Hello there, exclamation point. In the 18th year of our triple, I am interested to know what your thoughts are on achieving the PlayStation 3 frame consistency dream, running at 480p on a CRT/RetroTIG, overclocking, emulation, all of the above. So, John, this is an interesting one, right? Because what the PlayStation 3 does have a particular fascination, right?
Yeah.
It is arguably, actually, I don't think it's arguably, it's probably the least impressive of Sony's particular PlayStation generations, right?
I mean,
Overall.
I would argue that, yeah.
Yeah. And performance was a problem pretty much from the beginning of the generation to the end.
Mm-hmm.
I'm enjoying some of the suggestions here. Overclocking. I do want to try overclocking the PlayStation 3 GPU, but I've seen some videos and I'm not sure the results are going to be game-changing as such. Running at 480p, some games did actually scale down their resolution, so they did run smoother. Emulation. Now, you've investigated, I think, pretty much all of these options. So, what would be your thoughts in achieving the PS3 frame consistency dream in the year of our Lord, 2024?
Well, for games that do benefit from running at a lower resolution, then I think CRT is the way to go there. 480p on a CRT VGA monitor looks really good, and it absolutely helps with some games, but not all games, unfortunately. In which case, at that point, there's not that much you can do to improve it further outside of emulation. And emulation is, of course, a little bit finicky still. It's far better than it used to be, but the requirements per game are extremely variable depending on what the game was doing. So it can require some pretty serious hardware to pull it off well. But I think for the future, like looking towards emulation is the only way to really overcome the PS Triple's weaknesses. Which, yeah, it doesn't. The problem is it doesn't even benefit that much from, like, if you were to run it, the display type that was common at the time of release for each console is typically how it's best viewed. But with the case of PS3, that's not really the case, right? Like, even LCDs, if you bought their plasmas from that era and you wanted to match the common resolution of 1280 by 720, you really couldn't do it because they didn't sell those. They were 1366 by 768. So you always had to deal with some bit of scaling, which looks like garbage. Those technology, back then LCDs especially were awful. It was pretty much, well, I can imagine you sitting there with your Sony headset with the 720p OLEDs playing PS3 games. But there were also 720p projectors, but that was kind of it. Pretty much, I would say the vast majority of people playing on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, it was the 720p generation, but they were actually experiencing a double-scaled image. Yeah, which I think was due to overscan considerations, which I thought was silly for a fixed pixel display format in the first place. But yeah, I think DLP rear projection TVs also offered some 1280 by 720 options.
Right.
So, but at least today, if you want to do HD, then the RetroTink is really good for getting a clean 720p to your modern screen with perfect scaling. You can even simulate the pixels, but that doesn't solve the frame consistency. It's just, it is what it is. That's just the PS3.
Yeah, I think there are some screens that have nearest neighbor scaling as well. So 720p would actually go, it's a 3x3 upscale to 4K.
It's great.
But you're quite right, that doesn't solve the fact that...
Of course, Rich, very well that a lot of PS3 games did not hit the coveted 720p number either. So you're already dealing with scaling there, and pretty bad scaling, I would say, which is kind of where the 480p stuff comes in, because that kind of circumvents those problems. Because at worst, you get super sampling from a resolution that's only a little above 480p. But in general, that's probably the best way to play a PS3 on a widescreen CRT monitor that accepts 480p.
Wow.
You must be kind of a bit bemused by all of that, Will.
Yeah, it's a whole nother world. The PS3 was the first PlayStation console I ever owned, and I was like, "Oh, this is great." I had no idea I had any issues at all.
Man.
Yeah, well, I'm assuming you weren't a regular Eurogamer reader of Digital Foundry content at the time.
No, probably not. I don't think I had that kind of awareness. I was just like, this PC is pretty good. I'll do that.
I think it is pretty much emulation that's going to get you to where you want to go, but it does still seem that even years on, it's kind of like we're starting to approach an era where it's kind of stable emulation-wise, but there's still issues. But it's probably the way forward that's going to come good, I reckon. Yes, I think Judd's pretty much the expert there. So that's the end of this particular question. Therefore, the end of the show. Please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications that may or may not appear. No guarantees there whatsoever. Store.digitalfoundry.net to check out all of our merchandising wares, including this rather fetching bespoke t-shirt. Let's see if I can actually get the logo visible there. Woo! And the mouse mat that we was talking about earlier. I've actually got it over here, but you can't really see it because I've got so much junk happening in the background there. But yes, a Digital Foundry supporter program. Join us, join our amazing community, get early access to DF Direct Weekly each and every week, and of course, the chance to help shape the show. But that's all from us on this one. As always, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and we'll see you next week.